Hello, everybody. Yeah, so my name is Andy Land. I am the Global Head of Sustainability at the Focusrite Group. So you probably, I'm hoping everyone's kind of heard of Focusrite maybe, but actually the group that I work for is a much larger organization. We're 13 brands, 2 divisions, we're listed on the London Stock Exchange, 564 people worldwide, make about 500 boxes of various different materials with electronics in them. And I've been doing this job full-time for about 3 years now, although I've been with the group for much longer. So to frame everything that I'm going to talk about here today, we need to talk about net zero as a concept. And actually, the whole concept of it, the atmosphere, it doesn't care what one company does ultimately. And ultimately, net zero only is going to work when everybody achieves it. So something like carbon accounting, very useful for your organization to try and work out what your footprint is and work out what levers you can pull. But ultimately, collaboration has to be the long-term goal with anything. And that's what our strategy is all about. We've got these 2 columns that are about our footprint directly. So we've got an internal and an external column in our footprint that's looking at our offices and then the products that we manufacture. But then we've also got this industry focus, which I think long-term is going to be what we actually do primarily. And that's where we set the targets and we try and do things like this. So this is my first time at Radio TechCon, so thank you very much for having me. And I'm doing these kind of things, talking at events and going on panels and so on. To put into context what our footprint is, if you've not seen greenhouse gas emissions reporting before, we've got these 3 scopes, scopes 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 is the fuel that you use as an organization. That is basically going to be fuel that you use like natural gas or buildings in your buildings or vehicles that you've got, company vehicles. So for us, that's very small. Scope 2 is the electricity that you purchase. Again, very small for us. And Scope 3 is everything else. So for us, it's the vast majority. We're one of those organizations that's 99% Scope 3, and that's quite common if you're sort of electronics or a manufacturing company, unless you own your own factory. Within that Scope 3, 2 very significant categories for us. Manufacturing the product in the first place and product usage. That's 95% of our footprint. So with these 2 categories, when I look at our footprint and try and work out what our priorities need to be, and I kind of suggest if you're doing this exercise to try and think of this in the same way. If you look at 2050, the idea is to try and scenario plan what is going to still be there in that kind of time frame. So product usage, to do with the one on the right first, is probably going to largely go away. Renewable energy is outside of my control. I can't influence that, but it's coming online in increasing amounts. The EU has made particularly good strides over the last few years. So that one is not our direct priority. We're not going to go out and make electric radiators for fun, but we're going to kind of put that on the side. And manufacturing is the focus for us, because that's the far more tricky one that by 2050 is probably still going to be there. And the way that we're tackling that is by doing what's called product lifecycle assessments. And that's a component level analysis of products. This is my very simplified guide to basically 4 years of work and literally billions of lines of data. And to boil it down, you've got 3 steps. First thing is you take apart a product, you work out the ingredients list, just like you would find on the back of a pasta sauce or something. And I've got that for I was trying to think how many products I've done, 86 products or something. I've got that ingredients list that we've got for our products. And you work out then, by combining how much steel and plastic and so on, what the environmental footprint is, and you build up a raw materials footprint. And then you have to come up with whatever calculation model for the rest of your life cycle stages. So we've got 10 life cycle stages with our products. I've got a calculation model that's similar to that ingredients list for each stage. Then the really tricky part is to localize that footprint, because we sell one product in multiple years to different countries. The logistics is going to change, the electricity is going to change. So we take one product, we might make it across 3 years, sell it to near enough every country in the world, and I end up with about 600 to 800 carbon footprints for one product, which is why I'm also I'm hesitant about using the phrase carbon footprint, because it's not one thing, it's a range of possibilities depending on how long you turn it on, for example. And then you combine all of that with sales and production numbers, and you can get a carbon footprint, which is very useful, and engineering love this data. But like I say, it's not necessarily done in isolation. So if you're not aware, there is this whole world of alphabet soup out there. These will be on the quiz later to define every one of them. So 2 I've highlighted there, these all basically are going to apply to Focusrite or already do. And two on there that I've called out, CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project, and SBTI, which is Science-Based Targets Initiative. These two are really significant because both of them are surprisingly optional, yet CDP have managed to convince 2/3 of the world's market capitalization to report through their system. That, I think when I went to one of their events last year or the year before, they said that was $67 trillion worth of capital markets, which is, I was very surprised by that. I didn't realize it was that scale. And the SBTI is very closely linked to CDP. They've managed to convince nearly 10,000 companies to work and set what's known as the gold standard science-based targets for decarbonisation. And both of these organisations seem to be gaining a lot of momentum within the corporate world. And I'm actually often surprised by this because people don't often know that this is going on, that basically 2/3 of the world's economy is saying we're going to reach net zero. And actually what these regulations are trying to do, and going back to the ESG soup and the acronym soup before, all of the regulations are taking influences from CDP and SBTI now to say what we need to do is collaborate and contribute to that global effort to decarbonise. So one way that I find this is really useful is working groups. So much so, I decided to go and form one. So I've made this one called Greening Music Tech. I've joined various other ones as well. And I've managed to collect about 100 members so far from other organisations, other people working in organisations in music technology. So if you want to join Greening Music Tech, you work for a manufacturer, or you're just keen to join and just kind of take part, do find me. I will add you to the Slack channel. It's not massively formal. It's literally just a Slack channel where you can ask questions, but we found that very useful. We've had various meetups at Superbooth in Berlin, the GearFest show, Sound on Sound one at Carlyard earlier last year. So we're starting to build up this little network within music technology. And surprisingly, music tech is really lagging behind, where musicians are very vocal about this topic sometimes, which I think is a big disconnect we need to address. So if you can take one thing away from this, if you're starting out trying to work out what the footprint is of your products, it's trying to identify which part is exclusively yours and within your control. So for us, it's that manufacturing piece that if everyone else does their part, we're still going to be emitting that 50% roughly in the manufacturing space. So that's the part we're focusing on now. But if everyone does that, ultimately the world will move towards that net zero status a little bit faster. To give a practical example, I've got a pair of Adam Audio headphones. Now this is not a plug. We happened to release them a month ago, but if you want to see some recycled plastic, it looks perfectly fine. Honestly, people would not know the difference. And to the point that I'm actually telling other music tech manufacturers, go buy this exact thing, here's the data sheet, put it in your products. There's no point us in isolation going and making this pair of headphones unless we talk about it and get others to do it. So much so that we're doing this one product, and this is in our annual report that's going out in 2 days actually, so you can read all of the details in there. I'm literally giving it away. We've got 47 other products we've updated in the last year. So I said we have 500 in total, 48 or so in the last year have been updated with at least one initiative. So we're starting to roll out at scale, but it's taken us 3 or 4 years to get to that point where we can get the kind of momentum going, and others need to get going with that as well. It's not massively hard as well. A lot of these things are very simple. It's taking things out of the box, just changing how you manufacture things. To wrap up then, I think it's fair to say the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree target, is dead. That's not happening. COP had a deal at the weekend, probably was not as aggressive or as optimistic as I would have liked. But we need to kind of fundamentally remember, if we aim for 1.5 degree and we only hit 2 degrees, that's still going to be better than the 3 degrees we're currently forecast for, because everybody's going to feel these effects of climate change. And I think that the big takeaway that I've got from this is I've not seen any technical reason why we can't achieve net zero as a species, really. There is no reason the technology is out there. There's definitely political reasons and financial reasons, maybe why, but there's no technical reason. The technology all exists. So I'm going to hand over to Dan. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thanks very much. So Andy is an expert and a full-time employee on sustainability. So I'm going to take this from the opposite angle. So my name's Dan, and I founded a company called Broadcast Bionics, and we don't make nothing. We're a software company, so we're 25 people, not 500 people. We're privately held, so we don't have to do all the PLC stuff. We don't make anything, and we don't have anybody full-time on sustainability. I'm not even vegan. So why am I here? Well, I'm here because the BBC sent me an email in January 2023 saying we've got our big 6 suppliers, and Dave Walters just left the building, but it's entirely his fault. We would like the 7th to be a small company to see, can small companies help us to report to the CDP with these greenhouse gas protocol reporting requirements, because the BBC, and I think the hat tip to the BBC, because this is the sort of unique way they can lead our industry and still do, have set this climate goal of reducing those scope 3 emissions that Andy talked about by 28% by 2030. And Bionics and other small and independent suppliers have to play our part to do that, and we have to be able to help them report. So can a small company without full-time staff and knowing nothing at all about carbon reporting help report to the CDP? Well, there's one way that I am an expert, and I think everybody in this room is an expert. And it's not this recycling. I'm actually wearing the exact same shirt, belt, and trousers that I did when I last spoke on this stage 7 years ago on the subject of smart speakers, which we'll be talking about again actually later on this afternoon. Someone else will be talking about that later. Between 2017 and today, I've actually lost quite a lot of weight. It doesn't look like it on the picture because I put the weight back on again. And this shirt is still in heavy rotation in the McQuillin wardrobe. So if you take nothing else away from what I say this morning, reduce, reuse, recycle is what the experts would say you should be doing in your personal life. But what about your professional life? Because this is not a room which I think is synonymous with fast fashion. But what it is a room full of problem solvers and David Lloyd. So I love the way that in this slide, David Lloyd is like an exclamation mark at the end of the word problem. Looking like a sort of a Yeti in reformed trousers. But anyway, so the rest of the people in this room, David excluded, we solve problems for a living. And when you solve problems for a living, then you know that there's really 2 tricks to that. If you're going to solve a big problem, you have to take that big problem and break it down into a series of smaller problems that you can solve. And second of all, you have to start somewhere. So we got that email from the BBC at the beginning of 2023, and we decided that it was complicated how we were going to report carbon because the Bionics annual year ends in August, but you have to report to the CDP in June, July, which means we'd always be at least a year and maybe 18 months out of date. The BBC's accounting period ends in August. And so we decided, you know what, we're going to create a carbon year, which is the same as the calendar year. It also meant I could use operations and accounting resources in January and February to do this, not at our tax year end or year end. So we made a start and said, we are going to align our climate reporting with the year. And so we started in January 2022. You have to start somewhere and then you have to do something. So we then hired a French company, that's important, we'll come back to that. Who provide a platform that allowed us to capture all the data that we need to do to come up with these calculations. And we used them and their climate experts to mark our homework for us as we went about doing these calculations. So then we had to input into this platform all of this activity data. Now, activity data is the gold standard of climate reporting. It's the actual numbers of the actual electricity burned. It's the actual buildings and all of that sort of high quality data of what we actually do. So we audit everything about the buildings that we have and the way that we consume energy. Then we engaged our staff for 2 reasons. It's important to take our staff on this journey with us, but we also needed data from our staff because our staff work from home. So we asked quite a lot of intrusive questions using a platform provided by Greenly of our staff. What square footage of your home do you use for working from home? How do you commute to the office? How many days a week do you come in? What sort of central heating do you have at home? What temperature do you set your home at? That's activity data, and it's quite intrusive, in particular because we used a French company, for what you have for lunch. They were incredibly obsessed about how much we all ate for lunch each day of the week, because in France, that's what a working lunch looks like. This is what our lunch looks like. And that's on the 2 days a week I remember to eat lunch. And they didn't have a setting for that. So then we, fueled by a Tesco's value meal, did what software companies do, and we wrote some software. And we used that software from an internal systems team to take all of our accounting data and all the metadata of everything we do as a business and integrate it into that Greenly platform, which allowed us to take everything we couldn't measure with activity data, the gold standard stuff, and use expense data. And as of this year, so we've done 2 calendar years now, 2022 and 2023, by value we have accurately categorized 99% of the expenditure data from Bionics using that software and using the French platform. When we use expense data, it's nowhere near as accurate as activity data, because what you do is you take every pound you spend and you multiply it by an emissions factor. And this is where it all gets very, very fuzzy indeed. So in the middle there, from Greenly's platform last year, is the emissions factor for quite a lot of what we bought. The majority of what we were buying was IT and electronics. And each time you spend £1 on IT and electronics, that is the equivalent of 460 grams of carbon. To give you scale, 460 grams of carbon is exactly 1 pint of craft IPA beer served refrigerated. And that's important because when you understand emissions factors, they're not just the carbon in a pint of beer, the sort of stuff you might see frothing up. It's the entire life cycle of it, from growing of the hops, through to the brewing process, through to packaging, through to transport, and yes, the refrigeration and then the consumption at the end. So those 460 grams are not just the fizz in a pint of beer, they're the entire cost of the pint of beer, and that's what emissions factors really mean. So it does mean that if you save £1 on buying electronics, you can go and have yourself a pint of beer absolutely guilt-free. So the output of all of this work from us is essentially our own emissions factors that we've reported back to the CDP and the BBC. And so net, our emissions factor is not 460 grams of carbon, it's 225. But that's actually, if you look at what we do as a business, 3 quite different numbers. And we've chosen to report these separately because it's important that our customers understand that you can't just spend an average pound with Bionics. If you spend £1 on hardware through us, that actually is the equivalent of 440 grams. That's essentially generic lager, not craft IPA refrigerated. And that's 3% less than if you were just to use the regular emissions factor. They're very close together because for the moment, most of our electronics are bought at that standard emissions factor. But we know we can get that down by the BBC's magic 28% because as we work with the vendors that we purchase from, we can calculate that more specifically and more accurately. So there is something we can do about that. The ones we have total control over, we report separately. That's software, which you can see is 110. That's about the same as a 150 ml glass of wine, or a train beer versus a beer while you're driving a car. Also not a good idea. And then down the bottom, services and support much lower. Now weirdly, I employ about the same number of people and our turnover is very broadly the same between services and software. So the difference between 34 and 110 is all marketing. So we fly to trade shows around the world, we go to exhibitions, so that's the difference there. So we can see another area there which we can, as a company, change. We could, if we never marketed again, pull that down. That's a long-winded way of saying that I scored a C, which would really disappoint my parents, but fortunately they won't ever see this. But the first C I've ever scored, and it cost me an absolute fortune. A C is the report from CDP, and it's really very good. If you don't do anything at all, you get an F. If you do a little something, you get a D. We've moved up to a C. The BBC, again, hat tip to them, they're currently B on the CDP rating. And basically, to get anything better than a C, you have to not just have fairly good carbon accounting and reporting, but you have to be really proactive. So we have to go out and do things, encouraging our supply chain downstream from us and engaging more widely in order to move up from a C. But a C is very good. How did we do that? Well, we've explained it. What did that cost? First year, it probably cost us all up about £10,000. That's for the software, the platforms, the things that we did, and took about 20 days of full-time equivalence. That's operations staff, accounting staff, management, admin, project management, etc., in order to get to a point where we as a business could make this carbon reporting at the highest level of the CDP. The good news is, if you look at the left-hand side, that cost and that effort is coming down and down and down year by year by year. The bad news on the right-hand side is once you've done all that carbon reporting, then you have to engage in different ways with that. And so the cost and the effort on that right-hand side is going up. But that's also because that's where we actually make a difference. It's brilliant to measure stuff, but the right-hand side is where we can really make a difference. And so we as a business have a whole series of action plans. Most of these we've already done or are partway through doing. But these are the things that will allow us to take control of our own emissions factors, which means when the BBC and others purchase our products, we can make sure that they're reducing in a glide slope to meet their SBTi commitments in a way that if we just are at the whimsy of those emissions factors, we have no idea year by year what our customers might be able to procure from us at the equivalent carbon rate. So this is a room full of problem solvers. What were the problems that we had to solve? Well, one, we're completely the wrong scale as a company to be doing this. All of this stuff, like the CDP questions, are obsessed about your board and governance and forestry and things which 25 people don't have to worry about. So we were completely the wrong scale to be engaging with this. Good news is there is now SME reporting to CDP which solves some of that. The cost of this is pretty high, and when you're trying to run a business and be profitable, it's kind of unwelcome to have that cost up front, but you have to consider now energy costs have gone up, how doing this is actually quite good value to us, as well as having downstream benefits. And finally, we're a pretty nerdy, specific, weird kind of industry. There are no standards or emissions factors for what we do, and so we have to invent all this stuff along the way, which is where problem solvers find opportunities. Bionics is a small company, which means we're agile. We can do stuff that big companies can't do. But we're also a small company with big customers, which means the downstream impact from us doing even quite small or medium scale things can be really very large. And that's a cool sweet spot because we're in this area with very little measurement, very few people are doing this, and we as a small company can come in and make a really big difference. Here's an example. Oh, that doesn't line up in this font. So we can virtualize a product. So if we take the Telos Axia iPort, which we've now for 9 in Australia virtualized into virtual rack, into a virtual machine, if you use emissions factors to convert an iPort at sale into carbon versus putting that into virtual rack, you save 86.5%. The BBC are trying to reduce 90% by 2050. We could do that by this afternoon simply by accounting for it differently and virtualizing it and putting it into a piece of silicon from Dell. 86.5% for exactly the same product today without doing anything else. And the Dell box comes with a full life cycle analysis. So there's a lot that we can do just by changing the architecture. And doing that reduces the physical materials waste by 75%, the energy use, and allows us to do all of that stuff through remote support. All of that reducing the entire life cycle carbon of our products. But more importantly, downstream from us, Bionics operates in about 120 different countries with some of the world's biggest broadcasters. What we do downstream can make a real difference. It's pretty easy to get overwhelmed by big problems. We're problem solvers. You know what problem solvers do? They take big problems that you can't solve, break them into a series of small problems that you can. You know what politicians do? They take small problems and they aggregate them into big ones in order to persuade us all that we have to do something. Don't get fooled by that. As a group of problem solvers, let's take this, roll up our sleeves, and get to work. And if you want to join us on that journey, then there's a QR code that will download something to help you sleep tonight. It's about 100 pages of the data behind all of this from Greenly and from our submission to the CDP. And with that, I'll throw you back to David.
Well done. We have time for a couple of very quick questions if anyone has. There's a question over there. Thank you. If we can have the box. Where's the box gone?
I have to do an overhead, sorry.
Yay, well done. Go for it.
I have a question about Focusrite. With you making newer and newer technology products and the world's push towards AI stuff, have you had to get involved with the AI energy use, and how does that compare to just, for example, air freight of the components?
Yeah, AI is something that's not largely featured on our side of things yet, but every time I go to some sustainability conference, it's the only acronym, well, it's added to that other soup of other acronyms, but yeah, everyone's talking about AI at the moment. If you read Google or Microsoft's annual reports on sustainability, they see it as a way to find those solutions faster. I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced by that. I think I probably don't have enough knowledge to answer that, but it seems like right now that's only increasing the data center consumption in the world and may not be a positive thing ultimately. But I can see how it could be used. I mean, I use it to analyze climate scenario models, and then I can quickly read a 200-page document and find just something on shipping. But my energy consumption there is nowhere near the size of what's being used to train models.
Thank you. Dan, I run a company the same size as yours, despite never solving a problem ever. To what extent is this all a distraction for a business of your scale?
First of all, I think it's necessary. I mean, it's not just the BBC, but other of our customers are clearly going to be needing this data. I think if you look at the way that energy costs have gone up, we can see this is not just virtue signaling, this is a practical way for us to improve our own business. I think it's a good way to retain and hire younger staff. I think people will want to work for companies that are kind of doing this. But yes, I think we do have to be careful that this is not our core business. So we need to make sure that the way that we do this is in line with still delivering great products. But I design things for a living, and good design is normally, whether it's accessibility or this, actually if you look at the things that are sometimes considered worthy, the reality is they're actually also, frankly, just the byproduct of good design.
Dan McQuillin, Andy Land, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.